welcome back to the Embodied and Sovereign podcast. On today's episode, I have the absolute honor and pleasure of interviewing one of my favorite embodiment experts alive today, Michaela Boehm. So I was first introduced to Michaela's podcast several years ago from a good friend, and then her book, The Wild Woman's Way, partially because my friend felt like your life sounded very reminiscent to mine in some key ways, and that I'm still creating as well, such as like really getting into wild herbal medicine and when I was younger, and then just this dream that I still have to have an animal sanctuary. I immediately fell in love with Michaela's work, wisdom, and resonance, and have had the privilege of taking her teacher's training for one of her signature somatic modalities, the nonlinear movement method. But what really attracted me to Michaela's work so much is that she has this remarkable way of balancing the spiritual aspects of life with a very real and often messy and challenging reality of what it is to be human. She's also got a wicked sense of humor and is incredibly down to earth, even amidst her being an in-demand therapist to extremely high achieving people, such as Will and Jada Smith. So she often teaches globally, although maybe not during the pandemic as much, with her co-teacher, Steve James, another remarkable human being. And she has numerous online offerings and has been featured on a recent Netflix series called Unwell. She's the lineage holder of a female Tantra Shakta tradition, also known as Kashmir Shaivism. So, Michaela, I hope I accurately got your entire life story in that 2-minute introduction. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm very happy to, and thanks for having me.
So, one of the main reasons I and many others that I know love your work so much is your resonance. You are so down to earth, and in this field of like feminine embodiment in particular, there are a lot of people and women who are quite, I would just say, kind of woo-woo and quite out there, which I get, but it doesn't seem balanced in this way of like real, actual embodied experience, right? In this very human way. And you have such a great harmony of this, bringing like this spiritual and tangible worlds together. And I'm curious, how do you do that? Like, how do you like meld that together so well?
It's a good question. Well, here's the thing. When you say how do you stand in the world and also attend to your spiritual practice or the spiritual aspects of life, I think when life has knocked you about a bit, you'll realize that both life and spirit need attention, but it's not one over the other. And the important piece, I think, for me and for anybody I work with and teach, is that we don't bypass one domain for the other. And so the bypass can work two ways, right? You can do this massive spiritual bypass where you're escaping your life circumstances by going, it's all perfect, or, spirit knows, and whatever. And that's not that's wrong. It's just, it's not the entire picture. And of course, the other way around, you could also neglect spiritual dimensions or the dimensions of the mystical, let's put it this way, versus only cold hard facts matter, right? Like, so I think that the way to engage with that is to make sure that everything's looked at from all the different dimensions, and it has to line up and make sense. So how do I do that? Well, I have to live a very secular life, meaning, bills need to be paid, animals need to be fed, planes need to be boarded, or in the absence of planes right now in the pandemic, I still teach globally. But what that means nowadays means I have to get up at 12:30 in the morning, right? 12:30 at night or 12:30 in the morning, however you want to say that, and be on a Zoom call at 1 in the morning for Europe and the UK. And then, you know, do that. And then in the afternoon, do it for the US and Australia and New Zealand. And so what that means is life has to happen, and I have to, you know, attend to life where life happens, you
Yeah.
know, which is very much on the ground, practical, logistical, and all of that. And then at the same time, while that happens, all the other dimensions also happen, and none of them is more important than the other. They all are, it's like an orchestra, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And then in some of the pieces in, you know, that an orchestra plays, there's more violins, and in some of the pieces there's more horns or whatever, right? So it's like you want to have all the instruments going, and then you can play however you want to play. And that's something that I'm very, very adamant about, is that you're capable and well versed in all of those dimensions and
Mm.
not heavy on one over the other. And I find often with some of the people who who you described as woo woo, it's not true for everyone, but
Yeah.
I often it as areas are um, disavowed or kind of disparaged versus other areas based on proclivities or even capability.
Mm.
It's easy to say you don't need money and money is bad if you're not capable of making any.
Mm. Yeah.
Right?
Ah.
You know, it's easy to say that you don't want to be in the horrible masculine domain of your schedule because that's not healthy when you can show up on time,
Right.
right?
Right.
I think it's very important to make sure that all dimensions are tended to have some skill, and then you can pick and choose.
Mm. I love that. And you actually brought up another question I had, because I noticed this when I took your teacher's training, that you did have this schedule where you would be on with people in Europe time zone, and you're in California. And then you would get on later in the day with us here in the States or in Australia. And it's, to me, that just, I mean, I've traveled a lot and I understand, like, jet lag and this like severe lack of sleep and disorientation, but like you're choosing you're choosing to do this, obviously, for a set amount of days. But what do you do during that time that helps you kind of just really stay present?
Well, I think one of the things that I can rely on, which is why I can do it, is that I have enormous practice under my belt,
Mhm.
right? So, meaning I don't live a life that's, this once again goes to what you were saying earlier, but I don't live a life that's separate from what I do for work.
Mhm.
And my life isn't separated by spirit and making money or whatever, right? So, my life is such that every day, every aspect of my life is somewhat engaged with and dealt with.
Mhm.
Sometimes I need to do more work than I would like to, mostly more email than I would like to.
Yeah.
But my life is such that all aspects are always there. So when I have to get up at 12:30 at night, and it is very disorienting to start, usually I start with a lecture at 1 a.m.,
Yeah.
right? What allows me to do that is that I have both discipline, which is a big part of practice, right? I have both discipline and I have practice, so I can essentially put my personal likes and dislikes aside for that moment and just step up to the task at hand. So that's very useful. This is also what allows me then to go travel and stuff like that. But within that, I have very specific routines that make it so I can do these things a bit easier. And I'm not gonna lie and say it's not taking a toll on my body, because it does,
Yeah.
definitely, right? So, but that's a price I'm willing to pay for the ability to be able to reach people all over the world which gives me tremendous joy and
Yeah.
purpose, right? But I do things like I intermittent fast.
Mhm.
So I intermittent fast on a regular basis. And so what I do and I do this also with jet lag. So for instance, if we fly to Australia, I won't eat between when I leave the house here and the first meal in Australia,
Mhm. Yeah.
typically. And then that resets the body. And so I can use fasting and nutrition as a means of anchoring my body in different ways. So
Mhm.
that's super useful. And I eat ketogenic mostly, not always, but mostly. So I don't have sugar crashes,
Yeah.
which is really, really, I've noticed now with this year of getting up so early and stuff like that. If you have blood sugar crashes, you're not going to make it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are things I do. And then, of course, I also have to make sure that I do certain practices. Also, what you don't see here is I got a standing desk. I'm
Yeah.
not standing right now at this moment, but I got a standing desk, so I can lower the standing desk to the point where I can sit on the floor, and I can raise it to the point that I can stand, and anything in between. So I can regulate my body via the posture while I'm teaching and stuff like that. So I do all kinds of stuff so my body stays as with it as possible.
Yeah. I That's really helpful, and I what I'm hearing too is like underneath all of that is just this sense of like devotion towards like this bigger purpose that you have, that's like, you know, we hear this a lot in like, psychology or self-help, where it's like that we have to find that kind of intrinsic motivator, or what actually drives us. Otherwise it we will burn out, right? Or not take care of our needs in those moments. um, so I had this other question. I know you were featured recently on Netflix series Unwell, on an episode on tantric sex, and where you share a little bit about the kind of work that you do with some clients, and however you explain that, in this world of tantra can often be cult-like and murky, and people do need to be really careful. And what a lot of people refer to as neo-tantra. And so I have a little bit of, not a lot, but a little bit of background on more traditional tantra. And from my understanding, and again, it's not super clear, there's not a lot of crossover from what I've learned in that more classical sense, and what most people think of what is neo-tantra. And I know that you're a lineage holder of this women's lineage, and I'm just curious, like from your experience and like your lineage, how does this cross over, or does it at all, or where is that line, like where is that difference in your experience?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to say in full disclosure that, of course, because both of my background and my leanings towards very sustainable learning and growth and trauma-informed learning and growth,
Mhm.
I haven't gone to many neo-tantric events myself. Because I wouldn't expose my body to that kind of stuff,
Yeah,
right? For
of
a
course.
number of reasons. Also, as of course, the fact that I'm a teacher, and when you're a teacher, you don't go to other people's teachings, and you know, because it becomes strange and
Yeah.
weird and stuff like that. But so I'm saying a lot of the things that I'm saying
Mhm.
are gleaned from people coming to me, having done other people's workshops and
Yeah.
having done neo-tantric work, or having actual accepted teachers in the neo-tantric field, and stuff that one sees. Um, I, I went to one tantra workshop in an early part of my career where I lasted exactly 25 minutes of a 5-day workshop. So that's a whole other very, very funny story. Um, but that's a different story altogether. So that all said, from what I can glean and what is presented out there and I can read and see, um, the sexual aspect that is neo-tantra together with the very, so there's strains, right? There's the neo-tantric strains where it's all about essentially wild sexual exploration with an intention of breaking through established boundaries, pushing the boundaries, pushing the edge, which can have really enlivening effects. It can also really damage the body,
Yeah.
the nervous system, and resurrect or reawaken negative traumatic patternings, right? It can do all of that because it's force.
Yeah.
And anytime you work with force, injury can happen. But of course, force is very splashy and fun and, can create great outcomes. So there's that aspect that's highly sexualized. And then there's another aspect that's highly spiritualized, where it's all gauze and, adoring the goddess and bubble baths and violet candles and whatever, right? And feathers and heart, which is also can also be very lovely, can also be very, I don't know, same making, kind of, or creating a certain delusion, but it can also be very healing. And so in the way I was taught and in the way that I understand more classical Tantra, right? Once again, I'm not a scholar in that domain either. That particular Tantra is not a healing modality.
Yeah.
And it's often used as a healing modality in neo-tantric circles, and it's not.
Yeah.
You weren't even exposed in the way that I was taught. You weren't exposed to any sexual practice, inner or outer sexual practice, till you were of really sound body and sound energetic system and sound mind, essentially, right? And there was a lot of emphasis placed on things that had nothing to do with sex and that had nothing to do with wafting about, gazing into people's eyes or sitting on their laps or things like that, right? There's none of that, because that's such a small thing. And for instance, the root text of my lineage is the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which when you read that, there are instructions that have nothing to do with sex.
Yeah.
They have to do with the cosmic play of the masculine and feminine that can be translated down between two humans, men and women alike, man, man, woman, woman, man, woman, doesn't matter, has nothing to do with sexual orientation or identification, but it's become this thing, man, the masculine, feminine, that is all muddled together in these odd ways. So I would say that Tantra, as we know it to be written in texts and scriptures, has very little to do with Neo-Tantra. However, so this is my voice of reason here. And that's not to condone some of the stuff that's being done out there, because some of the stuff that's being done out there isn't particularly, I don't know, useful.
Yeah.
Might be thrilling, but it's not very useful. And then there's stuff out there that's downright harmful.
Yeah.
And then there's stuff out there that's really useful, that any human being should be able to maintain prolonged eye contact, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? There's nothing wrong with that ever, right? Learning good sexual skills, very important. It's not Tantra, but it's good to have good sexual skills. It's good to heal your wounds, but just don't call it that. But that's a different story. But what we can say is that in the best interpretation, this is true for some people, not all people, but in the best interpretation, we could say that a tantric approach to the body and to life could be translated into exercises and practices that infuse the body and the human with tantric principles that are useful and applicable to their life and their relationship.
Yeah.
That would be best case scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. it fascinates me because you know, when I first heard the word tantra, and for years I automatically went to this mindset of like it's like a cult, it's like weird and creepy, and then I discovered, non-dual Shiva Tantra, and I'm like, oh, this actually just makes sense to me. So
Yeah.
interesting to just hear like your perspective on like that difference and like maybe potentially how that came about, right? Um,
Well, how it came about is quite interesting when you look at like the first people who brought Tantra to the West.
mhm.
So one of the people who brought Tantra to the West was a man known as Arthur Avalon, whose
Okay.
name was actually Sir, I don't know what his first name was. Woodruff was his last name. And so, he went to India. He got exposed to some Kashmiri Tantra and whatever else, right? This was late 1800s, early 1900s. And then he came back and went, wow, this will help the suppressed people, right? The sexually suppressed people. And I like sex and I like to have lots of women and let me go at it, right? So, see, and there was somebody in America like that as well, were the first people who brought stuff
Mm,
were obviously most interested in the sexual aspect. And then other people who brought things back didn't want the sexual aspect. So they went like super heady into the
mhm.
scripture and and so it became very, like there was picking and choosing happening. And then, of course, the first people who came from India, and of course, there's also Tibetan Tantra, right? Which is
Yeah.
a whole other situation. But, when we talk about Indian Tantra or Hindu Tantra, then, people came like Osho, for instance, right? A lot of people don't know that most of the neo-tantric traditions in Europe, the US, Australia, can be boiled down to people who learned from people who learned from people who learned from people who eventually learned from a guy who came from India, and for instance, Osho brought brought tantra, but then combined it with things like process groups, encounter groups, brought in psychologists, did um, you know, did things that he thought would help Western bodies, and
Yeah.
so on and so on. So it all became very uh, shifted to address what happened in the 60s and 70s, for instance, right? And then people took that and shifted it again. And every time it gets taken, the person who takes it adds their personal um, both gifts and downfalls to it,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of that. And then, of course, there's the people who claim they're classic, but really their leader had some awakening and then went and read some books and now is teaching the thing or makes people do 6 hours of yoga when actually his own enlightenment, or what he claims is his enlightenment, happened spontaneously while he ate a muesli bar, right? Or, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
there's all kinds of interesting stuff that has no bearing on what it really is about, which is an integrated body, mind, and spirit.
I love that. Just that last little bit. It is. And that's why it resonated with me so profoundly when I first discovered classical tantra is it it's it's what embodiment is, right? In a way. It's like the spiritual tradition of embodiment,
That's
um,
right.
in a
Which,
nutshell.
by the way, exists in all traditions,
Yes. Yeah.
right? Because there were householders, and then there were people who lived a monastic lifestyle.
Hmm.
And they're very, very different practices. If you're living a monastic lifestyle, you need a very, very different approach to practice and to being with that than when you're a householder. And so, in each of the big religions and all the little traditions in between, there's always an embodied branch, so to speak. And Tantra is the embodied branch, so to speak.
Yeah, it has had that effect on me where I've gone back to kind of learn about other traditions and other religions again, and it's like, oh, this actually is making more sense now to me. Um, so I had this other question kind of related to this. So you in the teacher training, you talked about kind of where the nonlinear movement method came from, and it was originated, I think, if I remember correctly, when you were in meditation and kind of meditating on your central channel. And normally I think most people, when they're learning meditation, it's like you sit still, you kind of don't really move. But you kind of played around with like subtly moving the energy around your central channel and noticing how that um, had certain like effects on your well-being, on you. And I'm just wondering if you can hop back in time and kind of describe what that like discovery process was like, because that's really like fascinating to me that that's like the birthing of this movement method.
Mhm. Well, I didn't set out to learn how to meditate, right?
Okay.
So meaning my teacher back then gave me central channel practice, which is one of the, um, let's say, preparatory practices within my lineage, right? So, meaning the energetics within the body, and how does energy move in the body, which, as you well know, I teach a lot about and think is very, very important, particularly in a life where we spend so much time from here up, and
Right.
now
Yeah.
we're really spending a lot of time from here up,
Exactly.
right? It's very funny, actually, that uh, how things have turned out. So, which is why embodiment, I think, is more important than ever
Right.
before. So, so I didn't engage in meditation practice. I engaged in inner channel practice. So what that means, without going too technical, is that there's a central channel and then there's side channels. And so I did experimentations around, feeling those channels. Could I feel them? Were there contractions, tightness? What would happen? So there's breath practice and then there's energetic practice. And as I did that, and so that's traditionally done to begin with the body being still, so you're not distracted by the movements of your body, right? Nowadays, I teach those practices in the later years of the study of the women's study groups,
Mhm.
because there's preparatory practices to the preparatory practices to the practices who prepare you for next practices and so on, right? So because the body has a genius in learning, and there's layers you can you know uh, engage. Um, so you kind of sit in a meditation posture, so to speak, so your body is somewhat parked, right? And you're not distracted by what the body needs. And then you can kind of bring your attention inwards and become sensitive to what's happening inside. So the first thing I became sensitive to was my central channel and what that felt like. And then, of course, as you become sensitive to the inner workings of your energetic system, of course, if somebody cuts you open, they don't find it,
Yeah.
central channel. It's an energetic system.
Yeah.
But you can tell in your energetic system if there's any closures or kinks or dents. So then you become aware of the dents and closures, and then you can do energetic practice or breath practice, to and also meditation and other practices. And there's mudras and there's all kinds of stuff where you can kind of straighten
Mhm.
that channel. And so as I was doing this, I realized that if I would do movement, certain dents would get undented. And so it became kind of my personal fascination on how much could I do with the subtle motions of my body to affect my energy system. And I'm by all means a fairly nerdy kind of a girl. And I certainly was back then, where I could spend endless amount of time just exploring something and digging into something. And so that's how a nonlinear movement method originated to begin with, was my engagement with subtle motions in the body. And then, of course, I started learning about the nervous system. And I also had some pretty traumatic things happen back then in my early 20s. I lost two of my closest friends within a year apart, um, through death, right? And one of them, both of which were very traumatic. One was very, very aggressive breast cancer in my closest friend. The other one was a suicide, a very gruesome suicide on my male best friend. And so I got to road test the energetics of my body back then. And I didn't do that well with my girlfriend, which then led to the exploration of what it would take to actually be with strong sensation in my body. And that formed and informed essentially my work from there on out in a certain way. Is how do you stay in the body? How do you create resilience? How do you meet challenge? How do you meet death? Right? What is this? Right? What happens? Why did I have such a strong? So all of that plays into what's now the nonlinear movement method, which is a way to sensitize to the body, to regulate the body, to engage with the energy systems of the body. And there's still a strong aspect of, without me pointing to that distinctly, because it's not necessary to point to it, but the central channel and engaging with that core of our being, right, is still a big, big part. Because when the core of our being energetically, as well as um, from a, I don't know what the word would be, from a grit standpoint, when you have a strong core,
Mm.
you are much better equipped to deal with
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Um, and you've talked a lot about like how our like feminine energy is like, we were just talking about how like a lot of us, even more so now during COVID, we're like living from like the neck up, or like like the chest up. And when in a lot of your teachings, you talk about the feminine energy is more like down in our between our hips or something like that, and like our pelvic area. And while I feel this to be true, like I can feel it in my body, but it's still this like kind of ethereal understanding of like, well, but like for people who may not be so energetically self-aware, like, can you just explain a little bit more about what this means, and like this, just like why? I don't know if that's possible, but like
Yeah.
why are
Yeah. Well, these are,
feminine energies
they're
there?
not, they're, you know, that often these terms are thrown around in all kinds of esoteric or pseudo esoteric or spiritual ways, but really there's a few ways to slice it. And the simplest way to slice it is that when you are a woman, um, and I'm not going to go into this has nothing to do with your sexual
Yeah.
orientation or your identification, right? You can identify different than your biology. You can also have a biology and have a different sexual preference, and all of that's perfectly okay, and not an issue within what I'm about to say, right? So when you have the endocrine system and the organs of a woman, there's other aspects to being a woman, right? I want to just say that because I have women in my women's group who are transgendered, for instance, right? And so who are clearly women in all ways, except they weren't born
Yeah.
like that. So I want to say that because excuse me, there's many ways one can be a woman,
Yeah.
right? And there's also many ways one can be a man, and all of them I think are appropriate and understandable and should be honored, right? So I want to say that because that I think is very important. But what I'm talking about right now is just a human body.
Hmm.
So when one has a human body,
As
it
we
doesn't
do.
matter if it's male or female right now, right? We're not talking gender, we're talking nervous system,
Hmm.
right? So when we have a human body, then within the human body, there are systems that keep us alive.
Hmm.
And those systems that keep us alive as human beings are geared towards survival first, all else later. So what do we need for survival? Well, we need fight or flight, which is within our nervous system. And then fight or flight makes it so we can live, so to speak, right? We need procreation, which is, by the way, in the other aspect of our nervous system, rest and digest, right? Parasympathetic and sympathetic fulfill those two fundamental survival functions. Run as fast as you can, fight as hard as you can, or freeze in the bushes till the danger has passed, right? Uh, and when it's safe to do so, eat as much as you can, excuse my language, fuck as much as you can, right? So that's those are the two aspects of our nervous system. So those are active in each human being, and based on which aspect of that is more active, our energy is somewhere different in the body. So there's that.
Yeah.
So from that viewpoint, when we are in fight or flight, and this is, by the way, in a human being, the body doesn't know, is there real danger or is it perceived danger? So emotional stress is equally as detrimental or as activating to your fight or flight impulse than a bear walking by here. That would be interesting. You know? So from that viewpoint, when we are in fight or flight, our energy has to tighten, gather, our bodies have to tense, our blood has to pump really fast, our heart has to beat, our we create tunnel vision, and there's a certain kind of aggression plan forward motion, right? So this has not anything yet to do with men or women. That's just what the body does.
Yeah.
When we're in rest and digest, the energy becomes less localized. It goes in the areas that are needed for resting, digesting, and procreating. So down
Yeah.
into the lower body, where the sexual organs are, where the stomach and the gut sits, where we excrete, like all of that, where we bleed, where we ovulate, where we are pregnant, where we ejaculate, right? So regardless if you're a man or a woman, your rest, your feed and breathe or rest and digest happens in the lower parts of the body.
Yeah.
Your fight and flight happens up here, but also, of course, in the legs, unless your legs are frozen in freeze, right? But it's centralized, it's tight, it's tense, it's focused versus relaxed, open, flowing. So there's that. Men and women alike. Then, when you have a male endocrine system that leads a certain kind of life of its own, so to speak, to support the male species prerogative for survival and procreation and sex and hunting and killing and eating and whatever. And because before we become these evolved humans, our bodies need to live. And when you're a woman and you have a female endocrine system, you have to be able to maintain a pregnancy, you have to ovulate, you have to be able to give birth, breastfeed, attract a mate, blah, 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 blah. So then there's energetics that help with that. And so when we talk about feminine practices and being in our feminine, we're not necessarily just talking women, we're talking about the flow of life force through our body. But in women with a women's body who want to engage in that aspect of life, we have to take the endocrine system, our reproductive system, and all of that into account.
Yeah.
Right. But even in a man, having flow and relaxation allows for, all the things I just talked about. So why do I have particular emphasis in, for instance, the Wild Woman's Way, right, on feminine practice for female bodies? Well, because a lot of our regular life is in the fight or flight, go, getting stuff done mode. And so we have huge muscles in that part of our being, the go part, the often described masculine part of our being. And we don't have a lot of muscle in the flow part. And so if you want to engage in the flow part of your body as a woman, you're gonna have to do some practices. So that's a very long-winded.
No,
answer to that question.
I love that. It's really clarifying, and I know I've heard you explain it in a different way, but it's just landed a little deeper this time because it's again it points back to this way that so many of us operate, especially in just modern, I don't know, that's just Western, just the modern world, is we're so living in this kind of tight, you know, more masculine, go oriented energy. And um, a lot of people don't know how to relax. A lot of people don't know how to just like be in that more embodied space. Um,
Yeah.
so it's something that to kind of go off that is like in my own coaching, I've noticed not it's a very generalized thing, but I'm curious if you notice any tendencies like this of like I've it seems to be like when I work with women, they tend to get way more immersed in themselves and in that emotional realm and that feeling realm, whereas the men seem to tend to kind of relate to that experience more objectively, and
Mhm.
like they move through it faster, whereas like the women kind of like just like I want to say like luxuriate in it, where it's just like just totally like all of it, you know. But I'm just wondering if you've noticed that or any other kind of differences in kind of how we operate, and if there's any wisdom to impart that we can learn from you know, the opposite sex in this way.
Yeah. Well, I think once again, right, I sound like a freaking broken record these days. Um, I think it's very important to understand that before all our societal conditioning, uh, positive and negative, right? And all our relational considerations, survival, and our bodies functioning in the way optimized for survival is always there. And instead of working against that or negating that, when you actually accept that and take that into account, you can transcend it with choice and freedom and more, more grace.
Mhm.
But you can't, nature always wins, so to speak, right? You can't go against nature, and there's quite a bit of tendency for people to want to go against nature or to be down on nature, so to speak, right? So when you look at the biological prerogative of us as women wanting to procreate, that doesn't mean we will procreate, but we're engaged in that particular play, meaning we're not in a monastery
Yeah.
celibate. um, we want to be in that play of two partners, doesn't matter if you're gay or straight, right? You
Mhm.
want that that tension, that
Yeah.
tussle, the play, right? You might want to give birth or be creatively birthing things, right? So all of that requires the willingness to be full,
Mm.
because biologically speaking, you are going to have to grow a human inside of yourself. When you really think about that, right? That's some pretty far out shit,
Yeah. It is.
right? I mean, it's just like, what? Now, of course, it's also the most natural and normal thing, but we are like these very heady creatures. And when you really think about that, the fact that your body knows how to make another human from a blob, right, is nothing short of mind boggling.
Right.
Right? So that said, though, the disposition of receiving, um, just think of sex, right? So when you are a woman having sex uh, of a penetrative nature for the sake of procreation, which once again, not everybody does, but the
Mm.
general disposition, you have to open your body to a foreign object,
Yeah.
right? That's where it starts, meaning your energetic boundary is willingly broken, hopefully willingly, right?
Yeah.
But there's a huge element of surrender and trust involved and all kinds of things energetically. Then that breaking of your energetic boundary can result in something growing inside of you, and then you have to get it out of you, right? Via the same way it came in, so to speak, right? When you really feel that, I know it sounds really horrible when I say it like that, but I'm saying it on purpose like that, because when you realize that, you realize that the disposition of the luxuriating, the wanting more, the rolling around in the muck, positively as well as negatively, the willingness to engage with life is 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 what allows us to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the same time, and this is the other thing that can be quite a shadow when it's not explored, right? It's that need to be filled can get really, really dark,
Mm,
right? Both
yeah.
sexually, as well as with food, as with drugs, as with shopping, as
Mm,
with acquiring stuff, right? Like if it's not looked at or owned or cultivated,
yeah.
right? And then on the other hand, of course, when we talk about why can men just move through things and whatever, well, because no energetic boundary gets broken. You
Mm,
actually get rid of something, so to speak, right? The act of procreation in a man means they're ejaculating something, right? Giving it away. They can give it away all the time. Yeah, maybe they're energetically depleted, but maybe not, because some men are very, and
yeah.
then it's done and then they move on. There's no 9 months of whatever. And, so there's reasons why men are built different than women from that viewpoint. Like I said, that's a reductionist view,
Yeah.
simply to understand our base drives, which then should be cultivated and polished and also added to, and maybe transcended or integrated or whatever, right? But that's why, um, also if you have to go and kill things
Mm,
so your family can eat, you have to have a certain disposition,
yeah.
right? Um, and you have to, and that's not to say that men are not sensitive, because men are finely sensitive. It's
Yeah.
just a different sensitivity.
Yeah.
It's a different view, and when we allow for that view to be equally valuable, then we can have proper, exchange between the sexes, so to speak.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Um, I know we're coming up on the last few minutes here, and so I'm trying to decide which questions I want to keep asking. But I always like to hear what is when you're working with clients and students, what is one of your personal favorite experiences or realizations to witness or facilitate for them?
Hmm. I would say probably the thing that tickles me the most and that I'm the most intent on these days, this was not always true, but these days, is personal empowerment.
Mm,
So giving enough education, skill, insight, tools and motivations, so that somebody can make sense of themselves and learns what they need to learn, so that it's theirs and they're empowered to make their own decisions, their own epiphanies, their own learnings, their own practice, right? So that they're not reliant on me or Steve for the rest of their lives.
yeah.
So that when you come with that feeling of, oh, I implemented this and this is what happened, now I want more, and not from a place of, I can only exist if you constantly feed me, right? Like it's a growing up of the being, and it's an empowering,
Mm,
um into the understanding that we all have what it takes.
yeah.
So that's, I think, what tickles me the most. And
Mhm.
when I see people getting that, that's very, very gratifying.
Yeah. Ah. And what, who, or what is one of your greatest sources of inspiration personally?
Hmm. I would say my greatest source of inspiration in the biggest picture is nature.
Yeah.
Um, I draw enormous inspiration and comfort and strengths and all of that from the natural world within myself and outside of myself. So I would say that that's definitely um, uh, you know the biggest source. And then there's a few people in my life whose relationship, well, I should say there's a few people in my life where my relationship to them is, and the way I relate to them and the way um, the exchange happens and the way that allows me to kind of engage is hugely inspiring.
And then on the note of nature, kind of, I know that you have a animal sanctuary. Is it Moondog
The
Ranch?
Moondog Ranch,
Yes,
yes.
that's right. I love seeing the videos and the pictures that you share on social media. I just like, because that's a dream that I have as well, as to have this. Um, I kind of want like an old dog retirement center.
Oh,
But I'm just curious if you have like any fun or cute stories you can share about your rescue animals to just finish off this interview.
yes. Well, I have quite a few animals, and the Moondog is my horse. He's called
Okay.
the Moondog. So that's why it's called Moondog Ranch. It's a very beautiful, old, very old Appaloosa with, the white butt and the,
Mm,
yeah, but that's why it's called the Moondog Ranch. But um, I have dogs. I have quite a few dogs.
mhm.
And my pack of dogs has always been, a great source of joy and amusement. And, they're a handful. Um, so what's happening now that we're in, been in a year of the pandemic, and I've been home solidly for over a year, is that wherever I go, I am followed by the entire, well, almost the entire pack. I have two very, very old dogs that sleep most of the day, but the rest of them follow me everywhere I go. So when I'm on the move, they are on the move. When I'm stationary, they're asleep. So it's this hilarious thing that when I, like, for instance, now when we're done, when I go back to the house, I'm in the studio. When I go back to the house, everybody comes to life. And then everywhere we go together. And I am followed by this pack, and they're all very scruffy. They all look very wild and terriers mostly. And then when it's time for certain activities that they know that are routines, these activities are also accompanied by wild barking. So when it's time for food, it's like pandemonium that follows me on my paths to getting everybody food. So I find that very, very amusing and enjoyable. I'm
It's
not
very
not
lively.
sure how my neighbors feel about it, but I love the heralds announcing, my every move when we do food.
Yeah, I imagine it's always quite lively there.
It's very lively. The donkeys will bray when it's time for food. That
Mhm.
makes the dogs howl. They howl in a chorus like little wolves. It's very
Aw.
cute. And then, there's nighttime creatures that only come during the night. Not all of them good. Like I have a raccoon at the moment. So I have to be on, extra careful patrol so nobody comes to harm and all
Mm,
of that. So
yeah,
it's a whole life by itself.
yeah,
One of my many hats.
yeah. Well, I know we're at time, and I just want to say thank you. This went by really fast.
I
It
know.
has been such an honor speaking with you today, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your embodied wisdom and insight and resonance.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
for those listening who want to find out more about Michaela, her works, and her offerings, you can visit her website, michaelaboehm.com. That's michaelaboehm.com. Just want to make sure I spelled that right. And she has the second season of the 12 Facets of the Feminine starting April 26th. The next enrollment for the next teacher training is has early bird price available through July 1st and other offerings as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, review, and share. I also have a special free gift for all of my listeners. Just go to meganhart.coach/gift. That's MEGANHART.coach/GIFT. All my love to you. Until next time.